I think it's very interesting when you look at the onset of divisional play in the late 60s. And I was thinking about how much that might have had an influence on sort of the creation of rivalries in baseball. Because previous to that, when you only had the pennant championship at the end of the year, you weren't so much chasing any one team in particular for the division crown, but just sort of you were chasing the pennant title. So everybody wanted that.
Well, unless you were chasing the Yankees, I guess, in the American League for a long time.
But it's tough for the Yankees to be any one team's rival from that period. I guess more what I was trying to go with is just like, did the pennant races actually kind of devalue or disincentivize these rivalries from really burgeoning? Because you couldn't put, especially if that team wasn't as good as you. Like if you went another team, if the Yankees and the Red Sox both were only going for 80-something wins in a season, if you're playing in the pennant, it doesn't matter how much you hate the other team. Both of you don't matter. Yeah. But in divisional play, that game can matter a lot more.
And before 1969, when the divisional play started, and you had the Yankees in the World Series then through the 50s and every year, so they ended up having a rivalry in the World Series with the Brooklyn Dodgers because, oddly enough, and it's so hard to believe that kind of stuff happened, how many times the Yankees played the Dodgers during
which is not something
in the World Series.
Right, which is why you had that rivalry develop. And I do think it's interesting that the onset of divisional play has certainly helped them. It hasn't had that blossom as much as you think it had, because you still have the natural geographic rivalries. The Red Sox and the Yankees will always be rivals. That's just the way it's going to be. They're too close to each other. They don't like each other. Same with the Dodgers and Giants. But to the Houston Astros and the Texas Rangers, I mean, even with the World Series and the series,
they're trying to make that into
something. They're trying to make that into some kind of bad blood, but it's not there yet.
There's no history of that.
Right. If you wanted to say bad blood, wouldn't you argue that because of what happened in the 2010s, which we'll get to, between the Blue Jays and the Rangers, that's a lot more bad. Those two teams fought each other.
Literally.
Yeah.
And so we thought we'd go back and take the decades after divisional play started and just look and see what happened within the period from the 1970, 1980 until the last year of the decade, so to speak, in 89.
Did we have these teams meeting in the postseason and playing each other a lot? Because I think that's an important part to any rivalry, is that the games occasionally have to be for stakes. And I think that's why the Met rivalry with the Braves and the Phillies kind of has tapered off over the last bunch of years, is that they never play each other in the playoffs. So when was the last time the Mets played a series against an NL East opponent that really mattered, especially in the postseason?
The Mets and the Braves in 99?
Like, that's a long time ago.
That's a long time ago.
So I think that's part of the reason why you remember from the 2000s, you remember that Red Sox-Yankees rivalry, not just because of the epic series in 04, but they had other, because the year before in 03, the Red Sox lost in a heartbreaking series to the Yankees. And so that's what really fans the flames of these rivalries, is when you have these big, meaningful games that they're playing in, because nobody really cares. The Pittsburgh Pirates and the Cincinnati Reds might be rivals, but does anybody really care when they both have 77 wins in September?
Well, I'm going to start with that one, because I'm glad you brought that up, because it's interesting, because the divisional play began in 1969, and the 70s were basically in the National League about the Reds and the Pirates, and one thing we don't think about now is they were not in the same division.
Really?
So the Pirates were in the National League East, and the Reds are in the National League West with the Braves.
Oh, so that probably, because of their geographic closeness, that probably actually really heightened the rivalry back
in the
then.
playoffs,
right? Because you were from different divisions, so getting to play your neighbor in a playoff matchup like that would be a big thing for bragging rights in that area.
And so the Reds played the Pirates in the National League Championship Series. Now, we didn't have them before in 1969, 1970, so 19's the second year, 1972, 1975, and 1979. So that's the only time that happened.
Right, but four times in the same decade, the Pirates and the Reds met in the championship series. And so part of, I think another big aspect of it is that's all very close together. So you have the same guys on a lot of those teams.
That's true.
Playing in repeated matchups against one another. And I think that's another very important element. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen less rivalries develop, is that with players moving around all the time, yes, you can be a new player on the Yankees. You could be a new player on the Dodgers and be taught, yeah, we hate the Giants or we hate the Red Sox. But until you've been there for a few years and been through a few rounds with them, it's sort of an inherited grudge. It's not quite as personal as once you really understand and are part of that. But if you've been a Yankee for your whole life, it doesn't matter. You hate the Red Sox.
And the Reds and the Pirates, the Pirates didn't play the Reds in 1971. They didn't have to play them, and they won the World Series. So they got out of the National League, and then they did it again in 1979, where the Reds didn't make it. And that's the year they beat the Reds.
So they
finally beat them.
Right, so that must have meant a lot to Pittsburgh to finally kind of get out. Because, I am sure one of the things knowing sports fans that Cincinnati fans would tell them is, well, you didn't beat us in the postseason. You didn't have to actually go through the real team.
And that year finally happened. And we talked about in our podcast last week that there were sort of these things that they had the book ending with the Orioles and the Pirates in 71 and 79. The Pirates winning both of those. You had the Reds winning 2 in a row in 75 and 76. You had the Yankees winning 2 in a row in 77 and 78. And you had the A's winning 3 in a row in 72, 3 and 4. That decade there's no other decade like that.
Right, where you have the same teams winning and I think
consecutive years.
And I think it's really hard for two opposite league teams to become rivals.
Yes.
Really difficult.
Much harder today, obviously, because
just in general,
it's a gauntlet to get through the playoffs.
Right,
Remember, if you won your league and
but
you're,
even
and
then,
the Dodgers and the Yankees, you're in the World Series.
But now that you have to go through the gauntlet of the playoffs, the chance of you ending up in the same World Series against the same team multiple years in a row is just so unlikely that one of you makes it multiple years in a row, let alone both of you to play each other multiple times. So you're way less likely to see an American League team and a National League team really having this serious rivalry.
And, talk about the Reds and the Pirates, but the Orioles and the Athletics on the other side had their tete-a-tetes in the 1970s, 3 times ALCS, 1971, 1973, and 1974.
But was that a rivalry?
Oh, yeah.
So those two teams didn't like each other.
The Orioles won the World Series in 1970. They lost it in 69. They won it in 71. So they were a powerhouse team.
Right, they were the two.
And then the A's win in 72, 3 and 4. So those are the class of the American League.
It's just interesting to think about just because it's just like, okay, yeah, they were the class of the American League, but did they actually have a rivalry with one another?
That's a question probably better left to Orioles and Athletics fans to answer because as a fan, it seemed like it that way.
Certainly we know that the Reds and the Pirates have a rivalry. Those two teams, and I think that's a part of it is to me, it's kind of hard to have a rivalry unless the two teams don't get along.
Yeah, and even then today in today's Major League Baseball, there isn't that passion for the team that you would kill the opponent for your team.
Right, and that's fine. We don't need guys.
I agree.
It is as we often say, it's a fraternity of millionaires in Major League Baseball.
Right, and they're all interested in making sure that everybody in the club is doing okay.
Well. So it's never going to be the same where guys hate another guy just because he put on a uniform. But teams can definitely still not like each other.
And so 2 teams that really didn't like each other in the 70s are the Yankees and the Royals.
Right.
Okay, so if you think about that.
I thought that was more of an 80s thing.
Well, it carried over.
Oh.
Okay, so the Yankees and the Royals played in 3 straight ALCS in 1976, 1977, and 1978, and the Royals lost all 3 to the Yankees.
Ooh.
Right? So the Yankees lost the World Series in 76, won in 77, 78, and then the Royals got to the World Series in 1980, but they didn't beat the Yankees to get there. And the Pine Tar game wasn't until 1983. So we think about that whole stretch of time.
It's more than that stretch of time. It's a decade-long rivalry.
It's capped off with the Pine Tar game.
From the 70s into the 80s, and the Pine Tar game is obviously the height of that because then the Royals went on to win and they won the World Series that year,
in 85.
Right? They won it 2 years later.
Right,
okay.
They won in 85. So that was a blood rivalry. Okay,
right.
The Yankees and the Royals
did not like each other.
The old cliche, they don't like each other. They really didn't like each other.
I think that's such an important aspect to the rivalry. I can't have a friendly rivalry. It just doesn't make sense.
No. And so if I think that's the decade when I started going deeper into this and looking at them. I think that's really the only decade where you had that kind of years in a row of things happening. Everything else is kind of like, and we go to the 80s, and it just didn't really, we talked about 80 with the Royals finally getting the World Series. They lost to the Phillies, but no team was able to sort of stick out in the 80s.
And play the same team a bunch of times in a postseason series. I mean, obviously you had the carryover of the Royals and the Yankees, but I mean, thinking back, the Astros and the Mets certainly didn't like each other. But would you call that a rivalry?
No, that was a rivalry because it was a great series.
But that's only one.
It didn't extend
It's
into
only
other
one
years.
series. You only had that 186 NLCS. It wasn't like there was a bunch of postseason series against the Astros from the other years around.
Look, we're trying to slot things into decades, which is silly in a way, right? Because
that's not how careers
behavior
work.
doesn't work that way. But so the Dodgers lost to the Yankees, I said, in 77 and 78 in the World Series. In 1981, they played the Yankees again in the World Series. But it's a new decade. So the Dodgers, that was still sort of a rivalry
so there would be
in that way.
Because you would have, I think it's the players on the team are a big part of that, too. I imagine that 81 Dodgers and that 81 Yankees team looked pretty similar to the 78 team.
There were a lot of the same players, and the Dodgers avenged that loss. That was a big win for the Dodgers in 81. And I guess because I'm a Met fan, I want to forget about the fact that the Dodgers kind of hung around in the 80s, and they won the World Series again in 1988, much to Met fans' chagrin.
Because they beat the Mets
They beat the Mets in the NLCS, and I'll never forgive them for throwing Mike Scioscia a fastball. Dwight Gooden throwing him a fastball. It was terrible. And so the Phillies had trouble with the Dodgers in the 80s.
Yes.
Okay, so and they would play each other. They finally beat them in 83.
Like the Dodgers were sort of like the big bad in the 80s, but a bunch of but they weren't really. But
not really.
The NL teams kind of took their best shot against them. But since it was a bunch of different teams, not any one of them sort of sticks around as, oh yeah, it was the Dodgers and blank.
Right, and so that the Cardinals were the team that actually was more consistently around. I didn't realize that until I thought about it. They won the NLCS in 1982 and they won the World Series. They beat the Brewers. They won in 1985. They won in 1987, and they beat 3 different teams to get to the World Series.
The problem for the Cardinals is their biggest rival stunk during all this time.
The Cubs.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's kind of the hard thing is that when you have some of these teams
the Cubs got to the National League Championship Series in '84.
Who they play?
They played the San Diego Padres, and the Padres won and went to the World Series,
and then lost
to the Tigers.
Right.
So so that was about it for the Cubs in the '80s.
Right.
By the way,
but that's kind of the problem is that especially when you have these teams that have historical rivals, like the Cardinals, it's tough for them to develop any rivalry because their fans will never feel about that rivalry the same way they feel about the Cubs. Whereas, like, it's kind of interesting how certain, so the NL Central, you've got the Cardinals hate the Cubs. The Pittsburgh Pirates hate the Cincinnati Reds.
Right, and they weren't always in the same division, but yes.
But those two teams don't like each other. But it's like they all don't like each other, but those are the two most pronounced rivalries, and the Brewers are just sort of in the division with them now. But then but those are two very distinct rivalries. But then you look at some
Brewers are in the American League back then.
You look at the NL West. Everybody kind of hates the Dodgers, but the chief rivalry there is the Giants and the Dodgers.
From a historical
perspective, just because they're the two oldest teams.
Yeah.
But then you go to the NL East, and they just all hate each other. It doesn't matter. All of those teams don't get along.
I know the Marlins have been around for 30 years.
Yeah. The Mets, the Phillies, and the Braves are definitely the core component of that
I don't know why
rivalry.
I just can't get there. So I wanted to mention about the Royals again. So we mentioned that they beat the Yankees finally in 1980 in that decade, and they also lost the ALCS. They lost the World Series in 1984, and then they won the World Series in '85. So the Royals were good, in that first half of the decade, and then they weren't good, and we never heard from them again until 2014 when they went to the World Series, and 15 when they won it. So the '80s were ended by the Twins kind of coming out of nowhere in 1987.
Right. I think that's what's interesting as you move into the '90s, you start having them develop again because you mostly had those 3 teams at the top of the American League that all played each other a bunch because you had the Athletics, the Twins, and the Blue Jays.
Certainly into the early 90s.
Into the early 90s.
But the late 80s, featured the Twins and it won that, the Homer Dome World Series, and they beat the Cardinals, as we mentioned, in '87. Then in '88, you had the Dodgers, they beat the A's, and then the A's won the '89 World Series. So the A's kind of rose. And they actually made it all the way to the 1990 World Series, and they lost to Lou Pinella's Cincinnati Reds, which was a shock to everybody.
We were even just talking about that recently, about how that '90 World Series is kind of forgotten.
Right. And the Reds swept them, and the A's were supposed to, that was the Bash Brothers.
Right.
The whole thing with Dave Stewart pitching, and all of a sudden the Reds kind of came out of nowhere. So they started the '90s, and that was it for the the Reds in the '90s. They won the World Series in 1990, and they weren't heard from again. Mm-hmm. So and the '90s are sort of defined by, to me, the strike year. Because there was no World Series in 1994.
Especially because the strike, you had the strike year, then you had the 1 year, and then Yankee domination started.
Right, and there was really no hint of that before that.
Right, it was just, it kind of came out of nowhere in 96. All of a sudden, the Yankees were here, and they were going to win some World Series.
So in 1991, the Twins won their second World Series in 5 years, which was, and they beat the Blue Jays, which was a portent, obviously, in the ALCS, that the Blue Jays were going to be really good. And of course, they won the World Series in 92 and 93, did the Blue Jays.
And this was certainly, I mean, this was more rivalry between the Atlanta Braves and anybody from the American League, because it was just years of the Braves trying their best to make the World Series and then losing.
Yeah, and that was the time when they were just winning every division title.
Right, that was the start of it.
Very painfully for Mets fans and other NL East teams to look at. And so you got to 93, and then in 94, the Blue Jays might have had a chance, but the strike, hurt them because they never made it back again. It kind of like evaporated after 1993 and the World Series.
I'd say the biggest rivalry probably for the American League after the strike year would be the Yankees versus the Indians.
Yes.
They met a couple times to play for the ALCS to make the World Series, and both teams kind of won different games.
Right. And Cleveland made the World Series in both 1995 and 1997. Mm-hmm. So the Yankees
did not win either one.
Right, and then the Yankees obviously won the World Series in 96, 98, 99. So that was, you're right, that's the end of that decade, and that was some really great baseball.
Well, and you have that stretch now where you have the Yankees and the Yankees and the Indians fighting it out throughout the late 90s into the beginnings of the 2000s, but then at the beginnings of the 2000s, was there a better rivalry in baseball than those early 2000s Yankees-Red Sox series?
Well, if you're a fan of 4-hour baseball games, I'd say, which would be, for somebody who isn't a fan of those two teams,
torturous.
It was forever.
They would just go on forever. But those games were so dramatic.
And they would say at the time, the Yankees, they're so good at taking pitches and working the pitch. And like, no, the game's taking 4 hours. My goodness, please make it stop.
But like those games, I look back on them fondly. For whatever reason, those games seemed so much larger than life because of the rivalry. The fact that these two teams hated each other's guts, and the curse of the Bambino was between them. It gave those games this like richness to them that not a lot of other playoff series have had.
Right, and you had players like Johnny Damon who played for both the Red Sox and the Yankees.
Right.
Switching teams,
and Pedro Martinez throwing Don Zimmer to the ground in a brawl.
Yeah, that's a moment that Pedro wishes never happened. I'm sure,
because he really wasn't trying to.
No, just really bad. And then you had other teams in the 2000s kind of just show up, win, and never be heard from again. So you didn't get the rivalry thing, like the Angels. In 2002, they win, and they the Rally Monkey series,
and then the Angels never make another peep.
There's no more Angels.
The White Sox win in 05, and it's a forgotten World Series, more or less. They kind of won it and won away.
And then, the Cardinals, but once again, in this decade as well, the Cardinals were in the playoffs during the 2000s. In 2000, 2001, 2002, 2004, 2005, 2006, they won the World Series, and 2009. That's in the playoffs. That's not win play. So, but they didn't really have a rival, right, the way that it should have been.
And interestingly, that's something that even carries over when we get into the 2010s,
right?
Because they alternate World Series with the Giants for a couple years.
Well, they won they won in 2011,
right?
But the Red Sox won in 2013. But they all were in the World Series those 5 years.
Right, but it was like you never really felt like the Giants and the Cardinals
because they didn't play each other,
this, like acrimonious relationship or anything.
Right. They should have been playing like for the NL championship every year. That would have been
cool. And I think that's kind of where we're going back to with all of these rivalries is that if the Dodgers play the Braves in the NLCS for like the next 3 or 4 years, that's a rivalry. The Phillies and the Braves in the postseason right now, that's a rivalry because they've played a couple times in the past couple of years, and that's getting tight. If the Diamondbacks go back and play the Dodgers again in the postseason this year, that's how you get these rivalries because just playing in the regular season isn't enough. You need to have these playoff matchups with stakes for a real
and it has
rivalry.
To be more than 2 years. So, like the Yankees won the World Series in 2000 and 2009, but they lost the World Series to the Phillies in 2008. The Phillies won in 2008. They beat the Yankees, and the Yankees beat the Phillies in 2009. So you had the beginnings of something going on there.
It's so hard.
It's only 2 years.
It's exactly the same issue that you ran into with like the Dodgers and the Giants and the Royals. You had that amazing Giants-Royals World Series in 2014 going into 2015 where the Giants barely hang on to win. But it wasn't like they went back and played the Royals again in another epic series. I don't think they ever played a meaningful baseball game against each other again after that.
And you could have said that because the Twins faced the Yankees all those times in the 2000s.
One team has to be competitive.
Oh, that's right, because that was when the Twins started their 18-game
You don't
losing
have a
streak in the
rivalry
playoffs.
with your daddy.
And yeah, the Twins made the playoffs in 2002. They lost a division series in 2003 to the Yankees. They lost in 2004 to the Yankees.
They didn't just
They
lose.
got
They got swept.
I think they won a game. They won a game.
We're
because
debating
It
about-
wasn't until 2006 until
The-
they got
the
swept.
sweep
The sweep started, right?
Oh, no, it wasn't until a few years into the losing when it got really bad.
And they lost again in 2009 to the Yankees for good measure.
Right. I am sure the Twins getting a playoffs. That's the final monkey they have to get out their back is beating the Yankees in a postseason series. But winning one this year while they didn't make it probably felt pretty good for Twins fans.
So I think what we're really saying here is that, you're not going to have, like, you think about the way that it used to be with the same teams in the World Series year after year. It felt like,
Well, that was also because the same teams just had all the best players. So, the Yankees and the Dodgers are going to meet every year in the postseason because they have all the good players.
not just the best players, and that's true. I think it's just a gauntlet to try to get to the
Right.
World Series. So we've seen the best teams with the best records not make it out of the first
We
round,
talked
much less
about
make
that.
it all the way
So
through.
The fact for two teams to make World Series runs year over year to play each other a bunch is just too much to ask.
So you'd have more of these rivalries if you had the team with the best record in the American League play the team with the best record in the National League in the World Series, or even the two teams in each league playing for the championship
but
series.
now because you have the playoff gauntlet, we get a lot more great baseball. It's not as many great rivalries.
It's not as memorable in some ways, right? Because you don't have that, and I
kind of miss it.
I'm disappointed. I kind of miss it too, but hopefully we'll get another string of a few years with
It's
guys.
fun when they don't
make it
get
all the way.
along.